Hello YouTube, Sidekick here with a slightly different video. Actually, this video is going to be a bit more like a podcast, or hopefully it's going to turn into a series of podcasts, more than really a flight sim video. You can tell it's going to be a bit different because it's actually going to have a bibliography. Have a look in the notes of the video for that. In fact, I've actually kind of wanted to make this video for a while. My idea when I started out my series called The Iron Bomber's Guide to the DCS Universe was that I was going to do videos on all of the DCS Iron Bombers, starting with the last of them, the Hog and the Harrier, and working my way back to that other Thunderbolt, the P-47, which is kind of the OG Iron Bomber. Now, I've done that, and I've looked at the Hog, the Harrier, the Su-25, the 25T, the Mirage F1, the Viggen, the A4, the Sabre, the Mosquito, and the P-47, as well as some side trips to the F-104, OV-10, and the A-29, and even the T-45. And although there are more coming out all the time, I think that pretty much covers the current DCS aircraft for which dropping unguided munitions was part of the basic mission set. So I wanted to do that because I was fascinated by how you could follow the development of the aircraft over the 70-odd years that DCS spans. And over the time, that technology has changed a great deal, both in the aircraft and in the weapons that oppose them from the ground. And now, having actually flown and looked at all of those aircraft, I actually want to start back at the beginning and do a series of videos about those changes and about everything that's gone on and essentially why we ended up with the aircraft we ended up with. Because in point of fact, actually the most important thing that has changed over the last 70 years is the doctrine of the various air forces. Those doctrines have undergone dramatic shifts, and in some ways, the nature of the aircraft we fly in DCS has a lot more to do with the shifting sands of doctrine than anything else. And when the doctrine that spawned the aircraft ends up being out of step with the tactical realities that the aircraft encountered, well, that's when you get some really interesting things happening, both in the world historically, but also in DCS. Now, it's really not possible to understand why the aircraft are the way they are if you don't understand how they were expected to be used, and then how they were modified to deal with the threats they actually ended up facing. So the idea of this series is to follow that story of evolving doctrine and the realities of combat as seen through the frame of the aircraft we actually fly in DCS. The idea being that you can not only take my word for it, but you can also jump in the aircraft and kind of experience a little bit of the history yourself. So if we're going to do this, we have to wind the clock back a ways. I mean, the DCS iron bombing history kind of starts in about 1944. The two aircraft available in DCS that fit the bill as iron bombers or ground attack aircraft in 1944 are really the P-47 D-40 and the Mosquito FB-6. Now, neither aircraft was designed for the role of ground attack. The P-47 is actually a high-altitude interceptor that was repurposed for ground attack, and the Mosquito was originally designed to be a high-altitude level bomber that gradually turned into arguably the world's first multi-role combat aircraft. And that shows when you fly them and try to perform ground attack. Ground attack feels a bit like it was an afterthought in both aircraft, because it was. So we'll talk about that a little bit more at the end of the video, but for now, we need to understand the prehistory in order to understand how we got where we did in 1944. So let's wind the clock back, maybe to the interwar years. Actually, let's go all the way back to World War I. In World War I, the aircraft was an important weapon, and it became more important as the war progressed, but it was never decisive in the way it has become. It was not really used in the ground attack role. Army cooperation was the main role for aircraft, which meant in the terms of the day, reconnaissance, observation, artillery spotting. Now, the aircraft was very effective in those roles, and in fact, most of the air war in the First World War centered on preventing the other side from using its air assets effectively to do those things. Now, between the wars, the technology advanced rapidly, though. By the 1930s, aircraft were mostly all metal. They had mostly retractable landing gear, and they had much larger and much more powerful engines. An aircraft could carry a large enough bomb load to be seen as an offensive weapon. In fact, to many air warfare theorists, it seemed like the aircraft could literally become the decisive offensive weapon. This school of thought, prevalent particularly in the U.S. Army Air Force, was that fleets of multi-engine bombers could fly high and fast enough to be unstoppable, and they could destroy critical infrastructure in enemy countries and make it impossible for them to continue the fight. And this Bomber Mafia, as it was called, believed that precision bombing from a great height should be the focus of aircraft development and Army Air Force doctrine. Fighters in this doctrine were seen as purely defensive. They were there to engage enemy bombers and prevent them from being effective. The Air Force was seen as purely strategic. Not only that, but to the members of the Bomber Mafia, the Air Force was seen as the decisive arm in international conflict. The Army and the Navy were just needed to keep the enemy at bay long enough for the Air Force to destroy the infrastructure of the enemy's civilization, at which point the enemy would sue for peace. The USAF was the home of the most radical forms of this philosophy, but most air forces around the world, to the extent that there were air forces around the world, subscribed to some version of this basic philosophy. Bombers were the offensive weapon. They would be multi-engined and capable of carrying large bomb loads. They'd drop their bombs in level flight using precision bomb aiming techniques from high altitude. They would fly in large formations and drop cataclysmic volumes of high explosives. Now, although bombers were later seen as quite slow, the bombers of the 1930s are actually seen as quite fast for the time and capable of flying higher than most single-seat aircraft. Fighters, on the other hand, were short-range pursuit aircraft, designed to defend against the bombers. But before the advent of radar, which was an invention of the late 1930s, fighters were seen as having little hope of climbing high enough, fast enough to be effective against the bombers. So, this was Air Force orthodoxy in 1937, basically. Now, there were two air forces that bucked the trend to some extent, and these were, in a strange way, the Luftwaffe and the U.S. Navy. Now, both of these organizations, for different reasons, also embraced a different philosophy. For the United States Navy, it was really a practical matter. They couldn't fit large multi-engine bombers on carrier decks. And besides, their targets were not large physical industrial installations. They needed to deliver precision attacks against small point targets, meaning enemy ships, and they needed to deliver those attacks with single-engine aircraft that could be flown off aircraft carriers. Now, the Luftwaffe also wanted to develop the same capability, essentially, but for different and really more innovative reasons, I guess. Denied the ability to build out a large force of long-range heavy artillery by the terms of the Versailles Treaty, the German army wanted to overcome this deficit using air power. German doctrine called for the Luftwaffe to provide direct fire support to ground troops, often armored troops that had penetrated far beyond the initial front lines. So, the Luftwaffe also needed to deliver precision strikes against point targets, and it needed to do it from forward air bases, which, like carrier decks, were mostly suitable for single-engined aircraft. Now, the difference is that the Luftwaffe built the doctrine and the aircraft and the tactics around using airport power to support troops in contact. And really, at the time of the outbreak of the Second World War, they were pretty much the only air force that had developed this doctrine and these tactics. So, in the first major clash between what would become the Western Allies and the Germans in the Second World War, which would be the Battle of France, the Germans used their air power quite tactically, using stuiffs to deliver attacks against point targets, often in close proximity to their own troops, with great effect. The Allies' use of tactical air power was more or less restricted to two-engine bombers using level bombing techniques from several thousand feet against fairly large targets like bridges or railway marshalling yards. It was more or less wholly ineffective, except at reducing the bombers' numbers as they proved to be easy meat for the roving Luftwaffe fighters. Fighters on both sides were restricted to air superiority missions, either trying to shoot down enemy bombers or trying to prevent the friendly ones from being shot down by the other guy's fighters. So after essentially the debacle in France, the action in the air switched to a situation that was much more the one expected by the Bomber Mafia in the interwar years, and that was the Battle of Britain, which featured bombers attacking targets using high-level bombing with fighters defending and escort fighters defending the bombers. It's safe to say that the experience, even in 1940, was already beginning to prove that the Bomber Mafia doctrine had some significant shortcomings. But that didn't deter its proponents, at least in the USAF. But more on that later. So after the Battle of Britain, the next opportunity for the use of tactical air power in the West were the campaigns in the Mediterranean, including Greece and Crete and, of course, North Africa. To sum up 3 years of fighting in essentially a cartoon, it's basically true to say that while the Germans stuck to and refined their concept of the use of tactical air power in the form of accurate delivery of bombs against targets close to and near the tactical edge of battle using dive bombers specifically designed for that purpose, the Allies started out following the same basic doctrine held over from the Battle of France. That is, attacking ground targets was done by bombers using level bombing techniques from a few thousand feet. The role of the fighter was to disrupt the enemy bombers and, where range permitted, to escort the friendly ones. Now, gradually, over time, the Allies' doctrine began to evolve to increase the cooperation between the ground and the air forces and find more offensive roles for fighter aircraft. Basically, fighter squadrons began to find that on the way to, and particularly home from, their assigned air superiority missions, they'd spot targets on the ground, usually the ubiquitous motor transport, or MT. They began taking it upon themselves to strafe these targets with machine guns and cannons, and often to good effect. Gradually, the provision for carrying bombs was added to many of the aircraft flown by the Desert Air Force, specifically the P-40 and the Hurricane, and because these were increasingly outclassed by the latest Bf-109s in air-to-air fighting, but they did prove to be effective at attacking ground targets. Now, Air Force headquarters tactical planning staff were also moved closer to the front lines, and eventually, by the time of the Battle of El Alamein, they were co-located with the 8th Army headquarters, so there was some level of joint planning between air and ground. Bear in mind, though, that this bore no resemblance whatsoever to the modern concept of close air support. Responsiveness to requests from the ground was measured in units of hours or even days, and certainly not in minutes. Now, by the time the USAF arrived in the Mediterranean theater, the Desert Air Force was rapidly developing doctrine and tactics for operating a true tactical air force in support of ground operations. Increasingly, this involved more attack roles for fighters, the P-38s, P-40s, and P-51Bs, particularly since the Allies' increasing control of the air meant that there was less and less call for these fighters to act as interceptors or even escorts. Now, back in the European theater of operations, the P-47s of the USAF were busy doing the work of providing high-altitude, long-range escort to strategic bombers, which, much to the Bomber Mafia's chagrin, had proved that they could not, in fact, penetrate a screen of enemy interceptors. But this, in fact, ended up providing effectively a war-winning strategy for the Allies, because forced to intercept bombers escorted by also effective fighters, the Luftwaffe gradually wore itself out in the air war over Germany, which, in fact, paved the way for the Allies to enjoy complete air supremacy, upon which much of the D-Day planning was based. So, finally, we arrive at a point in time in the evolution of ground attack that's actually modeled in DCS. If we take the first real incarnations of those iron bombers in DCS to be the P-47D-40 and the Mosquito FP-6, and that is Operation Overlord, the invasion of France by the Allies. It was supported by 2 tactical air forces, the British Commonwealth II Tactical Air Command and the United States Army Air Force 9 Tactical Air Command. The main ground attack platforms for 2TAC were the Hawker Typhoon and the Mosquito FP-6. The Jug was the air-to-ground mainstay of 9TAC, supported by some P-38s and P-51s as well. Okay, but let's review the state of play in terms of close air support doctrine as the Allies enter the Overlord campaign in the spring and summer of 1944. So the doctrine had progressed to the point where the Air Force now acknowledged that it had a role to play in supporting ground operations directly. So this wasn't going to be done by two-engine bombers flying at several thousand feet and delivering bombs in level bombing. It was going to be done by fighter bombers. Now, granted, the Air Forces did not have a platform that had been designed to perform this role, although both the P-47 and the Mosquito ended up being pretty well suited to the roles they were given. Remember, the P-47 had actually been the premier high-altitude interceptor until long about the beginning of 1944, until it started to be replaced by the P-51 Mustang, which had even longer range than the Thunderbolt had had. But it was still obvious that the Thunderbolt was a very large aircraft. It was capable of carrying a very large payload. It was stable, particularly in a dive, and so it didn't take long for someone to figure out that it would actually make an excellent ground attack platform. In fact, almost as good a ground attack platform as it made a high-altitude interceptor. And so, in effect, the first Iron Bomber was born. The Mosquito arrived at becoming a ground attack platform essentially from the opposite direction. The original Mosquito had actually been an unarmed level bomber designed to fly very high and very fast and avoid interception, and it had actually performed that role earlier in the war. But again, because it was a fairly large platform compared to single-engine fighters, because it could carry a large payload, because it was very stable, particularly at low level, it turned out that it was an excellent platform, again, for delivering ground attack. In the Mosquito's case, it had spent a lot of the war actually doing low-level ingress missions. But at the time of Normandy, it realized that it would be an excellent complement to the Typhoons, and so a large complement of the 2nd Tactical Air Force wings were made up of Mosquitoes that were going to operate in ground attack mode using both bombs and rockets as well as their 20mm cannons. Now, as far as Doctrine goes, it had progressed to the point where it was obvious that coordination was required between the Tactical Air Command and the supported ground troops, and there was provision for making sure that there was coordination and liaison pretty much in real time all the time. That is not to say, though, that air taskings were basically provided in anything like real time the way they are today. Still, pilots probably would have received their target orders, or essentially their mission orders, as they took off. At least at the beginning of the Normandy campaign, there really was no provision for informing pilots about the situation on the ground once they were in the air, and this was as much because of the state of communications technology as anything else. Radios at the time were heavy and complicated, so there was no way that anybody was going to put an extra radio in an aircraft just to be able to talk to the ground. The ground vehicle normal radio net was not one that the aircraft could talk on, so in order to be able to talk to aircraft in the air, a special vehicle with a special radio, which was expensive and complicated, had to be built, and it had to be staffed by people who actually knew how to use the radios. And none of that was in place at the beginning of the Normandy campaign, although it did start to become available towards the end of the campaign. But we'll talk about that in a little bit. For now, just assume that pilots that were flying ground attack missions, they were based very close to the front. Almost by the time their wheels were up, they would have been over the front line. But they would not have been tasked with supporting troops in contact with the enemy. At the time of the beginning of the Normandy campaign, that was still not the doctrine that the Allies practiced. So let's take a look at essentially how the P-47s and the Mosquitoes and the Typhoons, which unfortunately are not modeled in DCS, were actually used before, during, and after the D-Day landing. First of all, it's important to be clear that the popular picture of Allied fighters waiting in cab ranks above the front line to descend and visit death and destruction upon German armor formations is pretty much a myth. In the first case, for most of the campaign in Normandy, air power was simply not used in close proximity to troops on the ground. It really wasn't until August and the breakout from Saint-Lô that the Americans in particular began to deploy what we would recognize as forward air controllers who accompanied ground units into combat and actually directed aircraft onto targets. Now, for most of the Normandy campaign, aircraft were tasked at the Army or Corps level, and they're typically not used to clear away immediate impediments to progress. And that's largely because if the Allied troops could see the enemy, they normally had access to ample land and sea-based artillery to deal with it. That artillery was effective, it was available, and it was responsive, and it was actually something they knew how to use. So they really didn't need air power to be employed tactically immediately in their front. It was not until the Allied armored spearheads started moving out of the beachhead and started outrunning their own artillery that there was a demand for kind of on-demand close air support. So that was much later in the campaign, like mid to late August. So for most of the Normandy campaign, fighters were used, I guess, in what we would call battlefield air interdiction today. Their job was to isolate the battlefield so it couldn't be resupplied or reinforced on the enemy's side. And within the immediate area of the beachhead, they were also there to ensure that the enemy could not perform even local resupply, redeployment, or reinforcement. And don't get me wrong, this was an essential ingredient to the Allied success in Normandy. Everyone, especially the Germans that were there, or tried to get there, agree that the difficulty and the attrition that the Allied fighters imposed on German movements starved them of the ability to mount a mobile defense or use their armored formations effectively, which was really why the Allies were able to break out from a pretty limited beachhead. But again, be cautious of the impression that this was because the Yabos, as the Germans called them, were tank killers extraordinaire. They weren't. Of the tens of thousands of vehicles that were destroyed by Allied air power in the Normandy bridgehead, and literally tens of thousands were, only a tiny fraction, probably at most a few hundred, were tanks or armored vehicles. The way that Allied fighters defeated the panzers was by destroying their logistical support at all levels, and destroying their fuel and their ammunition, disrupting their repair facilities, decapitating their formations by destroying headquarters, finding and destroying their supporting artillery. But by and large, they didn't do it by destroying the tanks themselves. It should also be realized that, at the time, the most effective weapon that the fighter bombers had was still their machine guns and cannons. Almost without exception, the accounts of Germans who were on the receiving end of fighter attacks mention being strafed. Most of them don't mention being bombed. Now, the second most effective weapon was probably rockets. Bombs were almost certainly a distant third. The fact of the matter was that bombs were just really difficult to deliver accurately, as any of you who have tried to do this in DCS will well know. Pilots at the time were happy, honestly, if they could get a bomb within 250 meters of the intended target. Now, that's going to be dangerous to infantry in the open or soft-skinned vehicles, but it's not really much of a threat to entrenched enemies or to any kind of armor. So, if you want to fly missions that were like the missions that P-47s and Mosquito pilots flew during the Normandy campaign, then you will want to either take off with a particular target assigned, like a target which is probably in the rear of the front line and consists of a known concentration of vehicles, or the location of a headquarters or a supply dump. Or you may want to take off and conduct a mission looking for targets of opportunity, kind of a combat patrol over the Normandy rear areas, looking for convoys on the roads or artillery firing, particularly rocket artillery. I'll bet that was a high priority target. Or trains, yes. Trains were also a very important target. You'll probably want to approach your target fairly high, like above 5,000 feet, to avoid any small caliber AAA. If it's a large, easily identifiable target, you'll probably be armed with bombs. For any smaller target or targets of opportunity, you'll probably just take along a load of rockets as well as your guns. You should probably expect to make multiple runs on the target, too. The whole one-pass, haul-ass philosophy is really the product of a different era when AAA was much more dangerous. Finally, if you really want to be authentic, you're going to want to bring along some friends. It's really hard to come to grips with the scale of the Allied air, or any other kind of effort. In 1944, economy of effort did not enter into the equation at all. I mean, raids were tasked at the squadron or even the group or equivalent wing level. That means you could expect to be attacking targets with at least a dozen other aircraft, if not dozens at a time. The idea of the two-ship or even four-ship strike element, again, belongs to a much later time. What the early iron bombers lacked in accuracy and finesse, they made up for in mass. Oh, and one thing you never, ever need to do is ever see a German aircraft. Literally no Allied fighter on a ground attack mission in Normandy ever had to worry about defending itself against enemy air threats. I mean, firstly, because the Luftwaffe was simply absent, but also because, in point of fact, the tactical air forces actually flew more defensive counter-air missions over the beachhead than they flew ground attack missions. It's actually true. For every Typhoon or Mosquito attacking convoys, there was at least one Spitfire flying overhead cover, often more than one. And this is what fascinates me about DCS and the sandbox that it kind of creates for us, is that we can go out and fly these missions in ways at least similar to the way we were flown. And when we do, we get an interesting appreciation of why the aircraft were the way they were and why they fly the way they fly. I mean, when you understand the job they were designed for and the doctrine they were designed under, you understand, for instance, why there are so many controls related to engine performance at high altitude in the Mosquito and the P-47, supercharger and turbocharger controls, and why those sorts of controls and switches are immediately accessible to the pilot. But, on the other hand, why air-to-ground armament switches and controls are seemingly randomly placed around the cockpit, often in hard-to-reach corners or down by your feet. These were all controls that were added to the cockpit after it was designed. And it's easy to understand now why the sights have no provision for aiming bombs. The P-47 wasn't expected to do that, and the Mosquito was expected to have a bomb aimer in the nose of the aircraft using a level bombing sight. Neither aircraft was designed with the idea that it would be used as a platform for launching air-to-ground rockets either, so neither one of them has any provision for helping pilots aim those. Similarly, when you understand the scale of effort that the pilots of the day were involved in, you can understand why finesse was really not part of the equation. The aircraft were as simple as they could be and still do the job, so they could be produced in as large numbers as possible. Pilots were trained to be competent and mentally tough. They flew several sorties a day at a pretty much improvised airfields. They slept in tents, ate combat rations a lot of the time. They got close to their targets, and they delivered lethal effects to enemies they could see, up close and personal, as they killed them. They flew as part of large formations with dozens or even hundreds of other aircraft in the air at the same time, in a pretty small volume of airspace, frankly. They flew a lot, several sorties a day, and even with relatively low loss rates, the amount of flying that they did probably meant that they came home missing someone they knew almost every day. To me, these are the biggest things that started to change after the Second World War. As the planes got faster and as AAA got more lethal, engagement ranges got longer and time spent near the target decreased dramatically. As aircraft became more sophisticated and more lethal, there were fewer and fewer of them available or necessary to have the same effect. So when you look around the cockpit of the P-47 or the Mosquito and you see a very spare cockpit with lots of levers and controls placed sometimes in odd places, you can understand why they were the way they were and why later fighters looked quite different from the inside and flew quite differently on the outside. So that's where we're going to leave it for today at the end of the Second World War. The next one of these series, we'll take up looking at what happened immediately after the Second World War. We'll probably talk about the F-86 and the Korean conflict. Maybe start thinking a little bit about where the Air Force and Air Force doctrine was at the beginning of Vietnam, which was, of course, the next major conflict in which the role of air power underwent a significant evolution, if not revolution. So if you're enjoying this series and you'd like to hear more of them, please do like the video and please subscribe. Leave a comment. That's always helpful as well. Or come to my Discord channel and talk about it a little bit.